Thank you for joining me. This is going to be fun.
I'm ready, Kevin. This is going to be a blast. We've been chatting about doing this for a while, so happy to get on the show.
Yeah, I want to give people a quick little overview of kind of just, our relationship and all of the insights and just information that I've learned from you over the years. So real quickly, you're a member of Flamingo.
I am.
I'm also in Flamingo DAO as well. I would say Flamingo, are we like the world's largest NFT DAO? I think so, in terms of just assets under management kind of thing.
Definitely. I think by quite a bit of margin at this point.
Yeah, so we do these weekly calls where everyone gets on a Zoom call and, we talk about projects. There's a little document, like a Google Doc that's shared, and there are a handful of projects that you go through and you say, what do you like about this? What this artist is doing that. This is a new collaboration that's coming out. It could be any number of things. And then we have to make decisions around what to invest in, what to buy, what to hold, and so on. And I will say that, when we first started jumping on these calls, I'm like, this guy, Derek, just keeps like dropping so much alpha and just insight into these projects. I'm like, who is this guy? And we got a chance to hang in Marfa and have since become friends. And I will say, and I'm not just trying to blow smoke here. Like you are, in my mind, one of the smartest collectors I know. And I would love to pick your brain and figure out how you form your opinions around these projects.
I am honored, and I feel very similarly about you and a lot of the members of Flamingo. Thank you for saying that. I am down for the challenge. I'm ready to chat and ready to kind of share some of my own thinking of how it's evolved over the last couple of years in the NFT space.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump in. I mean, let's talk about your beginnings in NFTs, like where you got started, what got you excited about NFTs, and also I think it's really important to talk about Collab Currency as well, where you are like the best in my mind. Collab Currency is if you go to the website, it shows how Web3 native you all are. Like there's NFTs all over the place. Like your bios are CryptoPunks. Which no VC does that, right? Like at least not in an authentic way. And you guys were the first to do that, which I thought was awesome. But yeah, we can get to collab later. But let's talk about your personal passion around collecting NFTs.
Yeah, I think I'll just give you some quick context on myself and Collab, and then I'll try and make it quick and jump right into NFTs and how I think about them. Grew up in Los Angeles, really into sports and art and music. Ended up playing competitive chess at the national level for about 8 years, which later turned into online MMOs and RPGs and online strategy games like Diablo and Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft and things like this. Graduated in 2008 from college with a sociology degree and creative writing degree. Worst time to ever graduate from college. I walked right into the financial crisis. Ended up teaching for a few years, grammar in middle school in Los Angeles. Hanging out with friends, working on creative projects, both music and art. In 2010, I did a surf trip with my friend Basil up and down the West Coast. We landed in a place called Eugene, Oregon, fell in love, population 170,000, thought Oregon was this amazing place, and ended up enrolling in the business school and law school out there. Graduated from both. I actually met my partner now while I was studying there. Graduated from both, took the bar, passed, decided I want to practice law, started a consumer products company. Got really interested in just why consumers use things and their purchasing behaviors and things like this. 2017, got really interested in the intersection of regulated assets and blockchains. I reconnected with one of my finance professors from the business school, Steve, who's now my partner at Collab. We started publishing together, started thinking about why that intersection was happening, what it would unlock. We ended up running a think tank for a little while, and then he asked me to jump in with him at Collaborative Fund, which is Collab Currency's originator. It's a traditional San Francisco, New York-based venture shop. I had been taking positions out of their main fund. Collab Currency was spun out of that, and we ended up spinning that vehicle out and doing our own thing. First pool of capital was 50 million, second was 65, and it's just Steve and I. We've been investing over the last few years. Invested in a number of Layer 1 projects. We're large holders of some of the top L1s. Steve's a finance professor. I'm trained as an attorney, so what was happening with DeFi was fairly intuitive to us. And so we took a number of positions in the DeFi vertical right before the run-up in 2020. And then I would say when things really started getting crazy was in the middle of 2020 when a project called Super Rare came across our desk. John Crane was working on this curated marketplace for one-of-one crypto art. I ended up taking a much longer time diligencing this project than normal. Ended up writing a whole thesis around crypto art, what it would unlock, representing kind of the contemporary art market on chain. Published that. We ended up doing that investment with one confirmation, and I would say that really got the ball rolling. From there, I mean, since then we've invested in probably 30 to 35 projects that are focused in the NFT vertical, and everything touching marketplaces to gaming to everything in between, financial infrastructure. It's where I spend most of my time, is just where Web3 touches consumer. Long story short is where I think the most outsized returns are going to happen over the next decade. So that's the quick and dirty.
If you all ever raise or your next fund, please call me. Because I look at your website at Collab Currency and I scroll down the list and I'm like, damn, those are good companies, man. You guys have a hot hand. Some fantastic investments there. So what about NFTs? When was the first time, you said Super Rare, but when was the first time you were like, there's something going on here?
Yeah, so we did a first call with John over at Super Rare just to pick his brain on kind of how he thought the market was unfolding. To be totally clear, the infrastructure and the NFT space more broadly at that point, this was just before summer of 2020, was pretty raw. There was obviously experiments that were being run. And I think what did it for me was I asked John to send over who he thought were the top crypto artists that people were really interested in. And he sent over names like Fuocious and Pac and Xcopy.
Oh my God.
There's a greatest hits on the piece I published.
Was this?
This was summer of 2020 when I started working through that piece.
Did you open your wallet at that point and start collecting? Because that would have been a great time to collect.
It's one of my biggest regrets was understanding the power of what they were building while not double-clicking on the artists themselves. I haven't made that mistake again. So long story short, I spoke with some friends that were working in the contemporary art market and tried to pattern match exactly the dynamics of what was going on over there with what was kind of happening on Super Rare as a curated marketplace, and realized pretty quickly that trust minimized ledgers and a curated marketplace that was focused specifically on one-of-one crypto art, as long as there were artists that were sought after and demanded and people wanted to collect, could actually be an amazing way to bring what was happening in the contemporary art industry to blockchains. I think the thing that did it for me was working through some of these early artists and realizing that there were collectors that were demanding to hold these things for $500, $1,000, $1,500. And when you dug in and spoke with them and worked through this, you realized pretty quickly that, art is really just a response to previous art movements and the time of kind of what's happening. And if you believed that digital art had its place in terms of, where directionally how artistic endeavors were being created, and you married that with what was happening with Web3 and trust minimized ledgers and recording digital works, any digital object of any kind on these trust minimized ledgers, you realized pretty quickly that there was going to be something special here. And so I'd say that was the big unlock.
Yeah. That is a very, obviously a very thorough and deep and well said way to describe the unlock. But I'm curious, the thing that I always have trouble with, and I'm sure you get this all the time, what's your cocktail party version of that? If people are like, oh, these NFTs, like they're nothing, they're just right click save as, like, how do you describe the importance of NFTs to, say, a cocktail party crowd?
Yeah, I would say we have always had scarce digital objects. I think, more and more over the last few decades, we're spending more and more of our time in digital environments. We've got things like Twitter followers. We have things like profile photos. If you've played any game over the last 2 decades, you realize pretty quickly that there are marketplaces for these goods, these digital objects that are trading, and people are valuing them, much like they're valuing anything in the physical world. And if you take the belief that digital objects can have value without blockchains, and they certainly do, like people have been trading these objects for decades on eBay and other marketplaces, then you realize that what's happening with blockchains is it's just a ledger. It's just a place to keep track of the scoreboard. It just says who owns what, when they owned it, and it basically paints a picture as to the provenance of that digital object. And if you marry those two trends together, you realize pretty quickly that's foundational for the next few decades of how value gets traded. We saw it with money and Bitcoin. We saw it with Ethereum. Basically, any digital object could be tracked and traded. And now, NFTs are really just an outgrowth of what we've seen over the last decade with Web3 and trust minimized technology.
Yeah. The durability of the blockchain versus, World of Warcraft at some point could shut down, right? You could lose that marketplace, right? There's something beautiful about the durability of the blockchain long term.
Absolutely. And, there's a funny story, too. I think it was Vitalik has credited World of Warcraft's nerfing of one of his characters, inspiring his trending away from centralized database structures towards these more trust minimized database structures, which informed kind of the Ethereum blockchain. So it's a fun look back at kind of like the just where we've come from, and I think it's a neat story that kind of describes what's actually happening here.
I'm curious, do you remember the first NFT you pulled the trigger on? And then also, I love when you speak to Flamingo about your conviction around projects. And I'd love to just hear how you build conviction before you actually, open MetaMask. Yeah,
this is a great question. So I would say so I did do some collecting on Super Rare. I was really trying to understand why certain artists were. I came into Super Rare a bit with doe eyes, really trying to understand exactly what was happening, why certain artists what their careers would be respected over time, whether they had a point of view that was interesting or native to the space. I would say the first real layup for me, no pun intended, was NBA Top Shot in the summer of 2020. I had played sports for a long time. I had played basketball for a long time. I had almost an encyclopedic knowledge of basketball for many, many years. And when I saw what was happening over on Super Rare and I comped it over to what was happening in the collectible space with Top Shot, I realized that the transition from physical cards to digital cards was actually pretty neat in the sense of clean. And so I went in and I just started collecting. I collected all sorts of players who had credible careers, up-and-comers, rookies. I think I have, today, my collection is still in the top 100, I believe, of all collectors on that website and that platform. And I would say from there, I also became one of the founding members of Flamingo DAO that summer. And so we had started taking positions on all sorts of stuff, running the experiments that were being run on Ethereum. To get to your actual question about like what predicates conviction, it's different for every project. So it's different if I'm evaluating a marketplace. It's different if I'm evaluating, an art piece. It's different if I'm evaluating a gaming asset. What I have to see is that there's a narrow scope between value creation and the object itself. And if I can get conviction that there's a path to that value creation over the next 3, 5, 10 years, then I can really dig in and really start kind of testing my assumptions and seeing if I can get there, if I can feel like the thesis can play out.
Wait, so let's unpack that a little bit. You said a narrow scope between the value creation and the object itself. Break that down for me. Explain it like I'm 5 Reddit styles. Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So let's take NBA Top Shot. So they were basically laying over a digital veneer over what had happened with the physical card market for many, many decades. They were basically pulling the same types of control, right? So this idea that there would be a scarce number of packs, scarce number of editions, scarce number of rare cards, rare players, but they were just doing it in a digital format. And if you comped that to what was happening in the physical collectibles market for cards, you'd realize that the top end of that market, things were trading for millions of dollars, if not tens of millions of dollars, depending on the player, depending on the edition, depending on the pack, depending on the series. And so if you looked at the top end of that market and you looked at the top end of the market that was still early, but getting created in NBA Top Shot, you realized just following a similar playbook, if you believed that this translation from physical to digital was happening, you could back into value getting created. There was a scope there of value getting created over the next decade in the digital collectibles market. Mm-hmm. I would say the unlock for me past that was once these things are trading in a digital environment, you can start layering on all sorts of really cool stuff. You can layer on utility, access. You can show that if you own this player, you have the right to see them in a locker room after one game. Or if you own this series of players that belong to this team, you have the right to go to one of the team days at the stadium. You could build a game with those collectibles that's native to Web3 and ownership over those assets. And so there was something very interesting about these things in this natively digital format that allowed me to double click and say, okay, I believe I formed a thesis around here's the base case. It's just physical collectibles on a blockchain. Here's where this thing could go over the next decade, and layering in all of these disparate experiments that were being run at the time.
Curious, I did not pull the trigger on Top Shots. I saw them, I wouldn't say early, but when they were starting to gain some momentum. And there were a few things that held me up, and I would love, as an expert in Top Shots, for you to school me here and tell me how you solved these problems in your head. One, weren't they using a different blockchain? It wasn't Ethereum, right? So they were using a different blockchain. That bothered me. The second piece being is that when I saw moments like Steph Curry hitting a three, I was like, okay, that's cool. There's Steph Curry hitting a three. He does that a lot. So in some sense, even though this is one of the first ones on Top Shot, just by the sheer nature of time, that's going to be a dilutive moment. Like, there are going to be a lot of amazing Steph Curry threes. Now, don't get me wrong. There are certain moments like Jordan doing his famous dunk, slam dunk competition, like the one that's posterized and put on it. Obviously, that would be worth millions and millions of dollars. Like, that is a very iconic moment. How do you think rookie cards makes a ton of sense to me? That's something that I collected as a kid. Something comes out as a rookie, I get it. Boom, I own that. The moments thing held me up, and the blockchain held me up. How did you get past those two things?
Yeah, let's talk about the moments first. So I actually think about this moments in terms of context, right? So like context can take a number of different forms. And I think about context as it relates to art and generative art and gaming. So let's definitely double click on those because I'd love to chat about it. But to tie it back to Top Shot, the context for why something is collectible versus not collectible could take many forms. It could be the type of moment, like you described, Steph Curry hitting a three-pointer. It could be the edition size, so maybe there's only 30 of those that exist. It could take it could be a player itself, the fact that Steph Curry is Steph Curry and not Russell Westbrook or LeBron James or some other player. It could be the fact that this was part of the first series that ever launched on Top Shot, so not Series 2 or Series 3, but Series 1. It could take the fact that the game itself, where the shot was hit, was actually a game that has some significance or importance for both Steph Curry or for the team itself, the Golden State Warriors. And so when you start to think about context, you start to realize that there's all sorts of different reasons why people collect things or why value has value. And if you can back into a card having context, a number of those contextual factors, you can see why something could be more valuable here versus there. I would say, like, my time thinking about the NBA and thinking about players and their careers, the longevity of their careers, where they sit, their cultural significance, these are all things I think about when thinking about collecting Top Shot. It's also how I think about collecting generative art and gaming assets and all sorts of things. But I would say just like it's all about the context. It's all about parameters for context. And if you can think like a collector thinks about collecting and think about what are those drivers for context, you can start to back into value. To get to your point about blockchains, I believe in a world a decade from now, 2 decades from now, where really like blockchains are just a commodity. It's just a place where digital objects get tracked and the scoreboard tells you what score it is. I think between now and then, the value of these things will go up and down. I mean, there's all sorts of shifting market considerations. There's tokens involved. There's demand drivers. And so between now and then, I think people conflate this idea of blockchain doing a simple job, which is really just a scoreboard, and the value it has in the market, which is like its token price. You know, we've taken the position that blockchains will be used for all sorts of different types of environments. We're starting to see Solana be a very important blockchain for gaming. We're starting to see Ethereum be a very important for tracking high-value collectibles and art. We're starting to see the Flow blockchain being used for more commercial IP or centralized use cases. I would say blockchains really at its core are just the scoreboard, and it's less important to me that it's on Flow versus Ethereum, and more important to me, like what types of things are on Flow, what types of things are on Ethereum, what types of things are on Solana.
Yeah, it's interesting that these blockchains, they're kind of known, at least, you know, today, they're known for these things. You're right. Like, you were seeing a lot of gaming because of the speed of Solana moving over to Solana. Tezos, great example of indie art that very, like, you know, punk rock show vibes. Like, you know, I love that feel about it. Object and Hin obviously driving a lot of that. What are your thoughts about, have you heard much about Palm?
Yeah, I've collected a couple of the currency drop from Damien Hirst. I think it's interesting. I think there's going to be lots of these, Kevin. And like, I'm not speculating on, for the most part, on which ones are going to be most valuable. I'm more interested to see on the demand side why certain artists are deploying on Palm versus something like Matic, versus something like Solana. What are the considerations that they're thinking through? Why do they think the longevity of the work that they're deploying in that environment is best suited for those structures? And then over time, the aggregate of that information is what helps inform me as to my own investment decisions. So I would say Palm's still pretty early. There's obviously credible artists that are deploying there. I think the experience that I've had as a collector there is still, I mean, it's early, right? Like, the infrastructure is still pretty primitive. And for me, it's just a wait and see. Like, I'm not willing to make an investment decision this early on in a project's life cycle. I'm kind of taking a more wait and see approach. I'm in the same boat, and I'm glad we're both aligned in that we're not laserizing anything. Like, we don't have laser eyes for just Ethereum. It's like, I want to go where the great art is, and I'll collect there. And I'm hoping it's not. I mean, we have lost blockchains in the past. I remember talking to Xcopy back in the day, and he was minting on some very early blockchains that are no longer around. Yes.
And those will forever be lost, and that to me is absolutely heartbreaking.
Totally agree.
But I think we're past that stage now, and I don't think there will be one chain to rule them all. I have begged you so many times privately on Discord to buy some of your Chromie Squiggles. You have the best Chromie Squiggles. Let's talk about that project for a minute. When did you first buy, and what are your thoughts on that project long term?
I have so many thoughts, Kevin, on Chromie Squiggles. I think it's one of the most important projects in this space, and I'm happy to talk.
Real quick, this would be a great excuse for you to kind of pick apart and understand how you go deep on a project. Like, I would love to know about how you investigate and kind of like prosecute through the different attributes.
Yes. So I'll riff for a bit and just stop me with questions.
No, go.
So I would say summer of 2020 is when I got conviction on crypto art. Joined Flamingo, started playing around with a number of the early platforms, started collecting myself, jumped into things like the CryptoPunks Discord. I would say CryptoPunks was a pretty big unlock for me. A project using it was a generative art experiment. The parameters and the algo were all done off-chain, but they used the blockchain as a recording format. Thought that was fascinating. In the CryptoPunks Discord, there was a mod named Snowfro who had launched a project called Artblocks. This was November of 2020. And, people were jumping over and starting to mint, and so I did the same. And I would say I've wasted so much ETH in this space, Kevin, just trying out things. I've blown so much money just experimenting, tinkering, playing around with things, because I think that's really instructive to just getting a handle on what's actually happening. Mm-hmm. I minted a squiggle, and my jaw dropped. I didn't know what the hell had just happened. And I remember minting like 7 or 8 more, and all were different.
When you were minting them, they were $50 a piece? What were they?
They were about $75 a piece.
Okay.
Yep. And I remember there was a small community that was in that Discord, the Art Blocks Discord. Had to have been under 50 at that point. That were just kind of watching. Somebody had built a bot, and the bot it basically showcased the mints that were happening in real time. And everyone was just kind of watching the mints and talking about them and exploring why they looked the way that they did, why certain ones had a different hue in this corner, or why they had a different height, or in some cases why they were sitting in a different category altogether. They looked like slinkies or fuzzies or pipes or hypers. And I just remember getting lost in that magic. And it took me, I think, a few weeks to really understand what was happening. I remember DMing Snowfro and just chatting with him about the process. And to rewind, I found this out later. I actually wrote this piece called Punks, Squiggles, and the Future of Generative Media. This was March 2020. It was a very therapeutic piece for me to write because it basically helped me work back in time through that kind of the generative media that was getting created in the 50s and 60s with Molnar and Naki and early computer artists, all the way through CryptoPunks, through Autoglyphs, and through Chromie Squiggles. And I would say it was through writing that piece and talking with Eric that I realized that there was 3 projects that were going to become instrumental to how media got created in this space. And it was CryptoPunks, it was Autoglyphs, and it was Chromie Squiggles. I think with CryptoPunks, I recognized pretty quickly that the innovation was, yes, this was generative, but it was generative off-chain and was using blockchain as a recording format. I think the design decision to have 10,000 of them was instrumental to community formation and why people were hovering around in the Discord, spending time talking to each other. It's because there were so many of these things, and it allowed, a low barrier to access for groups of people to come together and talk about all sorts of different things. At that point, the NFT industry was the CryptoPunks Discord. I think Autoglyphs took it a step further, and I remember talking with Eric about this. Eric was actually fortunate enough to claim a bunch of CryptoPunks, and as he was doing it, his question that he kept asking, given his history understanding contemporary art and generative art, was, is it possible to do this experience of generative art, but make it on-chain, fully from artist algorithm to each unique output, have it all live 100% on-chain, and have the blockchain be used as the artist's creative process instead of just a recording format? And I think he had some early conversations with the Larva Labs guys. He ended up becoming a mod, and I think inspired some of their design and technical decisions around Autoglyphs, which was the next pillar. It was this technical art experiment that allowed as much of the art to get stored on-chain as possible. And in that way, Autoglyphs are really the first on-chain generative art on the Ethereum blockchain.
Did you see the protoglyph we launched on Grails?
I would love to talk about the protoglyph. I got to be honest, it was a jaw dropper. And we should definitely talk about the protoglyph because I'm obsessed.
We can talk about that offline, keep going. Sorry.
We have a thread going on in Flamingo about the protoglyph, and I'd love to talk about Proof too because what I think you're doing over there is brilliant. The third pillar in minting these squiggles and playing around with the early Art Blocks project was going to be Chromie Squiggles for me, and it was the bundling of these 3 things that I really think has set the NFT industry on fire. Chromie Squiggles was interesting in that it took those first 2 building blocks and it leaned into these Web3 principles of community formation, networks, code-based creation, and it allowed Art Blocks, it was an instructional piece that allowed Art Blocks to become the first ever marketplace for on-demand, on-chain procedural generative art.
Yes.
It's this idea that it opens up the aperture of this on-chain generative art to any artist, any collector, anywhere around the world at any time. And which is another core fundamental building block that has really kind of set this space on fire. And so I would say it's the bundling of those 3 projects that frankly has taken the NFT world to new heights. It's CryptoPunks, Autoglyphs, and Chromie Squiggles. And in that way, I really don't think that any collector can have enough of those 3 projects. They're foundational to the space, and as we look back over the next few decades, I think people will more and more come to realize the importance of those 3 projects. I mean, there's this a great example. There's it's to comp it. There's this movie that I think about sometimes in the context of Chromie Squiggles and Autoglyphs and punks. It's called The Devil Wears Prada, mid-2000s, Meryl Streep.
Oh, I haven't watched that yet, but I know what you're talking about.
It's an amazing, amazing movie. Anne Hathaway's an intern. Meryl Streep is this owner of this fashion magazine. She's like the matriarch of the fashion industry. And Anne Hathaway has basically come into the space just to take a job, right? She's an intern, but she's like a hardcore journalist. She's working at this fashion magazine, even though she's not really into fashion. And there's this scene where Meryl Streep is working with one of her employees, and they're holding up two belts, and they're deciding which belt to put in like this new magazine that they're launching later that month. And the belts look identical. Like there's very subtle differences between the two belts. And Anne Hathaway's character starts laughing. Because she's essentially co-opted, she's basically decided not to be part of the fashion industry. She's said, she's basically taking the position that she thinks it's kind of a joke. And Meryl Streep educates her and describes to her that the clothes that Anne Hathaway is wearing it stems out of the decisions that were made in that very room. The blue that she's wearing on her shirt, the plaid on her skirt, the shoes that she's wearing, those are all decisions that have come from this lineage of Meryl Streep deciding what was cool, like what colors were in fashion, publishing it in the magazine, and then the magazine inspiring these different designers to design their new lines around the magazine. And then those designers working with distributors who would then make those clothes. And then you had the style end, and it would move on to the next season, and it would all go on again. But these distributors would have like these leftover pieces and garments and fabrics that would then go into making the bargain bin clothes that Anne Hathaway was wearing. And so even though Anne Hathaway had opted out of the fashion industry, the decisions that were being made in that room had inspired everything that she was wearing in that very moment. That's how I feel about Autoglyphs and CryptoPunks and Chromie Squiggles. If you look at the PFP projects today, you notice that all of them kind of trade off this idea of randomness, 10,000 characters, procedural generative work. Most of it's are off-chain, but trying to resemble kind of the on-chain behaviors that those three projects indicated. This idea of identity and community formation, it's really been inspired by those three projects, and I think more and more that will become abundantly clear to collectors as time goes on.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about a couple of your squiggles. I noticed, you have some that, quite frankly, are worth millions of dollars. How and when did you trade up? How and when do you decide to trade up? And then how do you go deep on attributes? Like, where do you get your research?
Yeah, so just so I've got an understanding of the question, when you say research on Chromie Squiggles?
Meaning like, if you talk to someone that's deep into Chromie Squiggles, they will tell you everything from, they've created these things called ghost Chromie Squiggles that they've named. They look at the segment length. They look at the animation and how it unplays. They kind of go in and almost at a contract level pull out and try and find little hidden rare things that they can add up and say, we're going to call this something special because only 15 of these have this series of attributes.
Yes.
For a new collector, if you land on OpenSea and you just look at Chromie Squiggles, you're like, oh, there's some fuzzy ones, there's some bold ones. I get it. Done. Okay, maybe I should get a bold one. But it goes much deeper.
Yes.
How do you know when to go deep? How do you go deeper so that as a consumer looking to purchase something, you make sure that you're seeing the entire picture?
Yeah. So the first thing that I did when I really started getting into Chromie Squiggles was really understand the distribution of the different visual rarities. So there's 6 main types of squiggles. There's the standard squiggle. About 60% of the whole supply are them. They're beautiful. They're just the rainbow line. There's the slinky. So about 11.5% of the distribution are slinkies. Fuzzies are next, about 10.5%. Ribbed, 7.8%. Bold, 4.5%.
Please tell me you're reading this off of something. You don't know this off the top of your head.
About 2%. I am reading it right now.
Okay, good.
Yep. But those are the 6 types of standard squiggles in terms of visual rarity, right? So you can look at the pipe, you can look at the bulb, you can look at the ribbed, you can look at the fuzzy, slinky, standard, and know that those are what they are. I would say the next layer of visual rarity are the hypers. So each one of those squiggles I just described, standard, slinky, fuzzy, ribbed, bold, pipe, each has a corresponding hyper variant. So there's the hyper standard, about 0.86%.
What does a hyper mean?
Yep. So this is where I would say you need to get Eric back on the show and really get into the technical granular rarities of how exactly the code is informing the hyper trait. I wish I could speak articulately on this, but that's really a question for Eric. But in terms of the original question, which is categorical visual rarities, there's the hyperstandard 0.86%, the hyperslinky 0.14%, the hyperfuzzy, which is 0.11%, the hyperribbed, which is also 0.11%, the hyperbold 0.07%, and the hyperpipe, the rarest of all the visual rarities, 0.04%. There's only 4 of those that exist. Mm-hmm. So I would say that was the first thing I did, was I worked with someone in Flamingo to chart out the statistical rarities and how the distribution shakes out for all the visual rarities.
And this is before this had been done, right? So this wasn't actually something that was known to the community. You said, I'm going to go deep here.
Yes, exactly. So I went deep here with another member. His name's Quick Rider, and we put together a graphic that basically described these different rarities, the visual rarities, and how they shook out. Now, there's also these granular invisible rarities that people get really excited about in the space. There's harmonics, which means that the body color of the squiggle blends into one of the background colors that Snowfro has programmed into the piece. So a ghost is essentially the body color of a ribbed, and the body color blends into the white background because it has a white body. I don't know how much of these exist. I mean, I know some, I think Quick will, and Von Mises will, but not off the top of my head, but I know they're quite rare. There's full spectrums, and then there's perfect spectrums. Full spectrums are when the starting color of the squiggle and the ending color fall within, I believe it's plus or minus 1% of one another, and the perfect spectrum is when the ending point of the squiggle is just one away from the starting point, I believe. It's either that or they fall on exactly the same point. I'd have to get clarification on that. But it basically refers back to the starting point and ending point of the squiggle. There's about 40 of the full spectrums and 20 of the perfect spectrums. So that's another layer of complexity and granularity that people like to collect on, in addition to the harmonics. Those are invisible traits, so people love collecting on some of these invisible traits, but I would say my collecting style, and I do own some of the full spectrums, but I would say mostly my style is really collecting along the visible traits. I just think there's something interesting to being able to visibly see these different categories, their hyper versions.
Let me ask you a question about visible versus non-visible traits, because this is a really interesting a point here. So when you think about the depth of a market, meaning the potential buyers for something, you go to Sotheby's, you have an extremely rare chromie squiggle. In some sense, even though something is technically rarer, but if it's non-visual, I would imagine that is not worth as much as a rare visible trait. Does that hold true? And the reason I say that is because if you're having a guest over and you're having at your house and you're like, hey, check out my chromie squiggle. This is, 2 decades from now. It's on a beautiful frame. It's framed in your wall. And they're like, oh, I've heard about these squiggles. They're historic, blah, blah. And you're like, no, but listen, it's got this one little funky thing behind the scenes that's programmed in and you can't see it, but it's extra rare. Like, that doesn't seem as cool and fun to me as something that you can visually look at and say, oh, I see how that's different.
Yeah, so I tend to agree with you, which is why largely my collecting style for chromie squiggles is predicated around visual rarity. That being said, there is most definitely a market for the invisible traits. Some of the top collectors I know love them in addition to the visual ones. I think there is something interesting about the complexity of this project and the code of this project that lends itself to having these Easter eggs like these rare invisible traits that people just love. With that said, I would say the market for chromie squiggles, both the top end and the bottom end, have largely been dominated by the visible traits. People collect floor squiggles based on their aesthetic value to them. People collect the high-end squiggles for their rarity features ascribed to their visible traits for the most part. So that's the bucket I tend to most play in when it comes to chromie squiggles.
Yeah, awesome. And I think for everyone listening, this is just an example. If you want to know how hardcore the serious collectors get into these things, you just heard it. I mean, this is the depth that you have to go if you really want to go deep. But I guess a better question now for you, Derek, is like that's squiggles. That's been defined. How do you catch stuff early now? Like, how do you find that alpha in today's world where there's just so many NFTs getting published and dropped every single week? We've got even more collectors and more coming online every day. Where do you find the alpha?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is, let me just tie the knot on Chromie Squiggles as it relates to that question, because I think this is an interesting question. I actually think I don't want to scare your listeners, Kevin, but we're in the only time in human history where we're moving from a pure physical recording format to a pure digital recording format. This is going to be a decades-long transition, and it will be the only time in human history when it happens. And so in that sense, we are very early. And I would say, like, as it relates to things like Chromie Squiggles, and I'll answer this on both the low end of the market and the top end of the market, I think we're incredibly early. So on the low end of the market, right now I look at Chromie Squiggles and they're, let's just say 5 or 6 or 7 ETH right now. I mean, there's only 2% of all Chromie Squiggles in the supply that are listed, something like 180 out of 10,000. And there's just a handful of ultra rare squiggles like regular pipes and regular hyper rainbows and the rarest of the rare, the hyper variants that are listed. I have to imagine, as more collectors come into the space and recognize the importance of that project, that those floors will look silly a decade from now or 20 years from now. And then on the top end of the market, I was chatting with Jan-Leo Coppens from Metaversal the other day, and we were comping projects like Chromie Squiggles and Fidenza and Ringers from both Cherniack and Hobbs to artists in the contemporary art market. If you look at Jackson Pollock, his work some of his work is traded for $58 million to $200 million. Kooning, $130 million to $300 million.
What's
Rothko,
the supply on Pollock though? Like, how many available artworks are out there?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I'd have to dig in and let you know. But I'm speaking more in terms of just like the very top end of the market.
Sure.
So
okay.
the grails of the grail. Rothko, 80 to 70 million. And you have to imagine, moving away from the floor, right? So the to the top end of the market, the ultra rare pieces in all of these collections. We look at some of the prices, some of the highest sales have happened for Cherniack and Hobbs and Snowfro. For Dimitri, I think his top sale was close to 7 million. For Hobbs, it was 3.5 million, and for Snowfro, it was 3.5 million. I mean, I think if you believe that these are the artists, among others, that are going to make the most impact as we look back, as we chart the line through art history back to its originators, the people who kind of helped build this movement, then you have to believe the top end of the squiggle market, the Fidenza market, the Ringers market, is still in its earliest stages, and these things are going to accrete massive amounts of value at the top end as well.
This is why you will have to pry my X-Copy one-of-ones out of my cold dead hands, and it'll be my wife prying them out, not anyone else. So
exactly.
It's like, I'm not parting with those. I think they're so undervalued.
Exactly. So to get to your actual question, which is like, where do you find alpha now? It's a great question. I think about it in terms of like, well, what am I looking for? If I'm looking for infrastructure, I really, the analysis there is quite different than like if I'm looking at like the project by project basis. I will say attention is the scarce resource. All right. So like it's the thing that drives value into everything that happens in this space. It's what builds community. It's what brings value. It's how things get priced. It's why people become emotionally and culturally attached to objects, to games, to culture. It's why we watch TV and movies. It's why we read books. It's why we socialize on Twitter and Instagram. It's why we, play games. It's attention, right? These things have captured our attention. And so when I think about it, I think about, okay, well, if blockchains are really just the board game that holds the pieces, the characters, the record book of like who is doing what, why they're doing it, when they're doing it, then the goal at that point is to find really strong dungeon masters, the people who can actually help, bring attention to projects. I was talking with Andrew Steinwald a couple of days ago, and he was articulating this framing to me, which I love. It's like blockchains are the new game engine, and they act as the source of truth to verify actions and to give rewards and to tell players where they stand. And taking that framing, if you can find, really great storytellers, really great dungeon masters who are able to capture attention and use that game engine or that board game, the pieces in a really compelling way that can drive attention persistently over the next few years, those are the projects that are going to create value. Now, this is outside of...
That's what we want to do at Proof, dude. We want to be the dungeon masters and do some crazy shit.
I would love to chat about Proof and double click on Proof, because I actually think what you're doing there is like pushing the industry forward in this exact direction. I think it's brilliant. Let's take Proof for an example, Kevin. You've got 1,000 membership cards. You've got a growing amount of people who want to enter this community every day. I'm presuming if you had that, pull tens of thousands of people at this point, many would love to participate in what you're building, the story that is unfolding, the process of being able to hang out in this community, to chat, to connect, to be a participant in these drops. That number is going to keep going up and up and up and up over time, as long as you keep the Dungeon Master role at its highest level. And and if you take that view, then these Proof cards are going to continue to just be immensely valuable over the coming years. That playbook is, I think, going to define how a lot of people treat, these projects, these community-based projects in the future. I think starting with 1,000 was a brilliant stroke of genius. I think, too often, I look at the typical 10,000 PFP project, right? And that's not to say that I don't think there's going to be PFP projects that have 100,000 or 500,000 in the future. There will be. But you have to really look and hone in on what is the demand drivers for that project as it exists today. And I think starting with something that you understood very intimately, that there are definitely 1,000 hardcore collectors that want to be part of this community early at its earliest stages, really set this thing up for success over the coming years. And that's not to say that we haven't talked about this. There may be ways for 50,000, 100,000, 500,000 people to come into the Proof community in the future. But starting at a part where the supply and the demand are at equilibrium was a stroke of genius on your part, Kevin. So I'm excited to watch this thing unfold.
Thank you for saying that. I think one of the things I think the Protoglyph is a great example when we did with Grails, that original Larva Labs early prototype of the Autoglyph. When I was thinking about, dropping something like that where people could mint it, if we had 10,000 members, that would have been minted hundreds and hundreds of times, right? And so you lose a bit of that scarcity aspect and the value. Just not that it wouldn't still be historically valuable, but I like keeping it on the rarer side. And someone was asking me you should do Grails every month, and it's no. I want to really take our time and make sure that we keep the bar so high, because that is. For this group of 1,000, that's the most important thing, is how can we always ensure that the projects that at least that we create, and that won't always be with the collaborations and allow lists and stuff that we do, but the project that we create, the bar is just at the absolute highest it can be. So that's the goal anyway.
Amazing.
So I know I've only got 20-some minutes of your time left. Speaking of new projects, I don't know if you want to mention this one or not, but I'll bring it up, and you could just say I don't want to talk about it. So on Flamingo a few weeks ago, you were like, I kind of aped into this weird thing, and it's because I saw the signal here, and I thought it might be something, and it might lead to something else. And do you know which one I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about. I'm happy to talk about it, but I
think it's a great example of how you see something, and you're like, that's not a fire. That's not even necessarily smoke yet, but there's some kindling there. And if a couple more cards get flipped over, then I bought in at the absolute ground floor. Would you mention that project?
I'm happy to. And I just want to set a caveat that the idea I'm happy to talk about this project. I have no idea who is creating it, who's running it. I have no idea if it's an investment grade project. All I will articulate is that I think there's something interesting here, and I'll explain why. But this is by no means an investment.
This could be a rug.
Opinion.
You don't know, right?
It could be a total rug, and I think this is where it gets back to a comment I made earlier, Kevin. I have my ideas for how this space will shake out. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. But at the end of the day, these are my ideas. There's all sorts of ways to to tackle the space, to explore the space, to make money in the space, to invest in the space, to collect in the space. And so I just want to be clear that, I want folks to have a wide-eyed approach to what I'll say here. So
one thing I want to add onto that too, obviously none of this is financial advice, number one. And number two, I'm like you, Derek, in that I'd rather lose money 9 times out of 10, and then that 10th time that it's not a rug and it's something massive, I was buying them for $100 at NFT or whatever, right?
We both share that in common, and it's all about portfolio theory, right? It's all about making the winners pay for the losers. So there's a project called Do Not Mint at Do Not Mint. I have no idea who's running it, who's behind the project, but if we take what I just described in terms of attention and kind of the dungeon master metaphor, I would say this is a project that caught my eye a few months ago.
How did you find it?
I was looking at different wallets. I like to just kind of dig into wallet discovery mode, see what collectors are collecting, why they're collecting it, see if I can chart out. It's a great way of kind of putting eyes on the space, and when I don't have time to kind of to originate my own thesis, is just seeing what other people are doing. I got to know
how you do this. What tool do you use to look at other people's wallets?
I use quite a few. So I think there's been, I would say I use OpenSea quite a bit for sorting and discovery for other collectors. I would say I use context.app a bit. I would say there's quite a few. I would say gallery.so just for seeing what collectors are proud of and what they're trying to build an understanding of curation around. I would say most often I use things like the OpenSea wallet discovery to just see when people are buying things, why they're buying things. In addition to kind of the normal, I'm in a number of Discords, a number of DAOs. I'm constantly meeting with teams and projects and chatting with them, and so through a collection of the activities I do, I'm able to kind of think deeply about why certain trends are happening or where certain projects may have a sign of kindling. So Do Not Mint was one. I came across it from, I had collected a project that was also very early, and I just wanted to see who some of the top wallet holders were. So I jumped over to Etherscan, was looking at some of the large holders of the project, and clicked on, took one of the addresses, put it into OpenSea just to see what else they had collected. And I came across this project with these vials, and it was called Do Not Mint. And I thought it was interesting. There were these vials, and so I started kind of trying to trace back exactly how this project got its start. And I found there was a contract that existed that you could interact with. There was also a Twitter account that had something like a few hundred followers. The graphics for the vials were done well enough that I thought that there may be something interesting here. And so I just started from the very beginning of their first Twitter post and just wanted to see, okay, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. And so the first post was, I think, back in November of 2021. And it basically was a series over the next couple of weeks of posting for them of just these teasers with visuals. The visuals were articulating some universe that existed, and I couldn't quite put my finger on whether or not it was an art experiment. This was seeding a game universe, whether it was a rug entirely. But this idea of Do Not Mint was plastered over a lot of the literature, a lot of the graphics, a lot of the teaser posts on Twitter. There ended up becoming another Twitter account that was launched with a second contract called Mint Only If You Trust the Process. And so what ended up happening was there was these two different Twitter accounts, two different contracts that were open, and they were interplaying with one another, kind of like a call and response, like a jazz piece. And one of them would refer back to another comment that one would say. They would use the same language, but their interactions on Twitter were vastly different. So the Do Not Mint Twitter handle is more, I would say, strict. There was just not a lot of liking or retweeting or posting outside of these daily or weekly posts with graphics. On the Mint Only If You Trust the Process, it was run more like a DGen account. There was all sorts of likes and retweets and commenting and very.
But you're sure they're linked?
I'm not sure, Kevin. But they have both used the same verbiage, and they have both kind of connected to one another at different points in time. They have both referred back to the same visual assets at times. It looks as if the art styles are similar enough to make a connection. So this is an example of a project that I think was capturing my attention. Do I think there's something here? It's totally unclear, and I think it's still very early. But if attention is the scarce resource, and if I'm, super busy, I'm, 15-hour days, I'm meeting with teams, I'm advising projects, I'm very busy. If I'm spending, what little free time I have trying to check in on this project every couple of days, like there's obviously something pulling me in this direction. They're doing something right. They're telling a really interesting story and narrative. Now, I think this playbook of this idea of the dungeon master, especially when there's not anything else at this stage, it's more of like a metagame than anything. I think this playbook is really interesting, and I'm always willing to explore projects that are playing at the very edges of the space around this. So I took this project to Flamingo and Neon and a couple of the other investment DAOs, and we just started a collective of members, started just geeking out over it, trying to piece the clues together. Chris F., who you've had on the podcast, has really gone down the rabbit hole, a few others. But frankly, it's just been a way for us to kind of explore a new project together when there isn't really anything there. And I think we're all kind of waiting to see what happens. In the meantime, I did degen in and mint off the contract directly from both of them. And I did it from a wallet that's not my normal wallet, so there's no, hopefully no security ramifications. But I would say like these are the types of projects that I think are most interesting, or some of the most interesting projects, ones that are able to capture attention. And if you can do that, then you can monetize in some really interesting directions over the coming years.
Thank you for sharing that, because that is the reason I love chatting with you and love hearing you on Flamingo, because I'm like, he likes weird shit too. Like I would be right there with you. I'd be like, okay, let's do this. Let's mint some of this crazy stuff,
The truth is, Kevin, I had the exact same feeling when I was minting Squiggles. I would share this project, the Chromie Squiggles, with others. And for many, it was like, I don't understand. What are these rainbow lines? I don't understand why this thing is, important. Like why would I want to collect one of 10,000 of these things? How are these things even going to be valuable? The space was so different at that point, back in the fall of 2020. There wasn't really value ascribing to things that had that much supply. Yeah. It really did feel like you were laying your ETH on fire. And so I would say the thing, there are going to be projects like this over time and time again. And some of them really will be rug pulls. Some of them really will be things that don't really go anywhere because the execution is detached from the idea of what I'm describing. Maybe the people that are driving the project aren't very strong. But I think if you can hone in on this idea of a project really being able to capture attention and then really have a strong team being able to become a dungeon master and capture that attention persistently over the coming years, those are the things that really thrive in this space.
Wise, awesome advice. Derek, I know I've got about 10 minutes of your time left because you're so busy. You mentioned the 16-hour days, and I know you have another call to get to. I do want to ask you one final question that I struggle with, and so this is very personal for me. How do you know when something is too geeky? And when I think of the complexity of Math Castles, or I think of the open-endedness of Loot, and not sure if people are going to come together to create anything compelling here. How do you evaluate things like that? Yeah.
I would also say that this dovetails neatly into a conversation that I've been thinking about a lot, which is like, what is the role of CCO projects? And like, can these things be valuable? So like Loot, Math Castles, and a number of these projects that are kind of these open-ended universes of like people and like people to build upon them. Let me answer that question first, and then I'll talk about like what is too geeky. So I would say I vacillate on whether or not I think I love the idea of like these open universes, open IP, bestowing rights, intellectual property rights, and letting community just run wild with it. I think that is conceptually correct. I think the execution to this stage and like creating important, valuable outputs has been very poor. I haven't seen anyone take IP, like community take IP and drive immense value with that IP in the same way that I've seen smaller teams be able to drive immense value out of that IP.
Well, I think Bored Apes would be the exception there, though, right? You get Jimmy Fallon on showing off his Bored Ape. That's community driving some serious value to the IP, though, right?
100%. And I would actually say that Bored Apes is more in the bucket of controlling their IP than they are completely bestowing it and making it a CCO project. I don't think Bored Apes...
Because they're doing the serum, they're doing all that stuff versus like something like Loot where it's just like, go have fun. You know?
You got it exactly right. So Bored Apes still controls that IP. They still bring immense value back to the project completely differently in the way that Loot does. Like Loot is saying, here are the assets, build. And I would say the trade-off is interesting, right? The trade-off is like, you're leaning really into these Web3 principles of community formation and networked NFTs and allowing anyone to do anything in any direction that they want. But you're trading off this idea of like some centralized group that brings value persistently over and over and over again. And so like until that needle gets threaded in a way that I think we just haven't seen anyone thread that needle totally right yet, which leads me to believe that like the CCO is directionally correct. This idea of like pure CCO is directionally correct, but the execution just needs to step up for us to see projects rally around IP in a way that can persistently bring value back to its community. And I think we'll get there, but until then, it kind of blends into this bucket of kind of too geeky for like consumer retail. So that's like the first part of the question. The second part of your question is just like, what's too geeky? And I would say I don't know the answer to that. Like, I think we're still at the very earliest innings of like how value gets created in this space. I'm still not convinced we know how, like the technical decisions of, like sometimes these very hyper technical decisions that geeks love end up becoming the primitives by which new projects get built.
Do you own Math Castles?
I do own a few Math Castles, and I think it's a fascinating project. I'll give you an example where like the technical decisions that Larva Labs made with CryptoPunks, then Autoglyphs, and then Artblocks took and made into like this generalized marketplace format for any artist and any collector, those three primitives have ended up informing these more retail-focused products like PFPs, right? So I would say it's those technical geeky decisions that have really led to an onslaught of like, you know, this idea of like the mint process or like the PFP as a marker for identity, or this idea of like randomized minting so you don't know what you're going to get when you press the mint button. These are all core concepts. This idea of like 10,000 PFPs to like form communities. These are all kind of geeky decisions that informed more retail-looking products.
That's a great point.
I would say the geek in me really just wants to try as much stuff as possible, waste as much ETH as possible to really understand, get over that bar of understanding of what are the disparate experiments that are being run, because I know those decisions may end up informing some of the most important consumer products in the future.
Yeah. And I think when you say waste ETH, tell me if I'm getting this right. In my mind, it's the venture model in some sense, in that you're making investments in, you know, entrepreneurs, but in this case, like artwork or collections of developers coming together. And, you know, 8 out of 10 times they'll probably go to zero or next to nothing, or very low floors or below what you paid. You'll have those couple that will then return all of that capital for the ones that you lost. And then, you know, 1 in 50, 2 in 50, 3 in 50, if you're lucky, are going to be the fund makers, the ones that return those 1,000x plus returns that really make it all worthwhile. Is that the lens you look through?
Exactly. And I would say the longer you do this, the better you are at making that number not be 1 in 10, and maybe making it look more like 2 in 10 or 3 in 10 or 4 in 10 or 5 in 10. But I would say it's the exercise of going through this in terms of thinking about how you operate in the space, both from an intellectual perspective, but then also a collector perspective. Going through the exercise of thinking about things as a portfolio, right? Mm-hmm. And really leaning into this idea of like the math and portfolio theory and the returns that get driven by the outsized returns that get driven by the moonshots.
Yeah. Awesome. Derek, well, I know you got to run. Thank you so much for this conversation. The most important thing people can do right now is to follow you on Twitter, because your insights, your access, all that you offer, you know, some of that comes through Twitter as well. So could you tell people where to find you there?
Yeah, so I'm at DerekEDWS. You can follow us at Collab Currency 2, at Collab, COLLAB _CURRENCY. And then I'm at Derek Edward. So at DEREKEDWS, Derek Edwards. But Kevin, this has been amazing. We're going to have to, there's so much I want to chat with you about. I want to dig in more on Proof. I want to dig in more about infrastructure projects and platforms and vertical marketplaces. I want to dig on PFPs. I want to dig on all of it with you. So let's do this again in another 90 days or so.
It would be my honor to have you be a regular contributor and member of this podcast. So I'm happy to do this every few weeks. Like, you just let me know and we'll make it happen.
I'm looking forward to it. We'll definitely do this again sooner rather than
later.
All right,
brother. Great chatting.
All right, Kevin. All right, man.
Talk soon.
Chat with you soon.